The first big name you'll probably recognize in our discussion of classical composers and music is Antonio Vivaldi. He was around in the mid-Baroque period. His specific dates are 1678 to 1741. He was an Italian, born and raised, worked in Venice, Italy, mainly a violin virtuoso, composer, conductor, and teacher. One of his biggest accomplishments for us in the realm of music in general is that he basically created and standardized the style of what we call concertos. And we have two styles of those, whether it's the solo concerto where you feature one instrument versus the orchestra, or you have a concerto grosso, which is a group of soloists, 3 or 4 instruments featured against the rest of the orchestra. He wrote close to 450 of those during his lifetime, hence why we call him the father of concertos. One of the main ones that you'll notice and you'll recognize right off the bat is La Primavera, or the Spring, from Four Seasons, and it's one of his most popular works, if not the most popular works of all time. So a little bit of background about him specifically first. He studied violin with his father. His father was a violinist in the St. Mark's Cathedral, so he had a strong musical bloodline to work from there. He showed a strong promise at an early age and kept playing and working towards this virtuosity throughout his life. For 10 years, early on, he spent time studying for the priesthood and even took holy orders. He was a big, tall, skinny man with a big shock of red hair, and so many people during the time called him the Red Priest for that. He was a priest, big red hair, the Red Priest. Easy enough. The biggest post that he had during his lifetime, and he spent 35 years working here, was at the Ospedale della Pieta, or the Pieta, as we call it, which was a girls' orphanage and music school in Venice. It was one of the 4 that was around town and during the time. And like I said, he spent 35 years working there, very highly prestigious post during the time period, very favored by the Italian public, the Venetian public of the time. It was a very musical city where, kind of like, say, like Austin, Texas or something here in the States nowadays, you would hear music on every street corner all the way up to the fanciest concert hall, but it is a very music-hungry city, so the audience, the musical audience of the town waited and adored these performances that were given at these girls' schools throughout the year, basically on a weekly basis. And also during that time, he did have some freedom to tour around Europe and show off his virtuosity on the instrument, performing some of the concertos that I previously mentioned. And in the performance of those, he was just usually the director or the producer of kind of the conductor of the orchestra as well. So let's talk about the style that we call a concerto grosso. The grosso part, meaning big, is the fact that we have a group of soloists, a small group of soloists, usually 3 or 4 players, featured against the rest of the orchestra behind them, and you have this kind of back and forth between the two parts. So in discussing a concerto grosso, we refer to the soloists, the group of soloists, as the concertina, and then the tutti is the rest of the orchestra, tutti meaning all. So you have, again, the tutti is the orchestra, and the concertino is the group of soloists that are kind of featured or pitted against the rest of the orchestra there. These were generally written in three movements, which Vivaldi basically standardized for us in a fast, slow, fast regimen there. And so the first and last movements were in what we refer to as a ritornello form. Ritornello meaning a return or a refrain, so there was always like the chorus of a song kept popping up after breaks in the work for the soloist to take their turn. And the ritornello, the refrain, over time would evolve or modulate into different keys. You might even at some points just hear a fragment of it, a blip of it, instead of the entire thing that you would hear at the very beginning and the very end. In the home key, you just have these little development ideas of it throughout. And then one of the other strong features of it, of a concerto just in general, is this invention, shall we say, of a cadenza, which was an unaccompanied solo kind of showpiece for the artist to just show off their ability, their virtuosity on the instrument. At first, these were predominantly improvised by the performer, and as time went on, composers, and more so in future generations, started actually writing down and composing specific cadenzas that they wanted the performers to play in the works. So as I said, Vivaldi basically set the standard for the form of a concerto. This fast, slow, fast orientation that I mentioned of the three movements of a concerto. So the fast movement, the first movement, is a more dramatic kind of alternation between the tutti and the concertino, the soloists and versus the orchestra. And they move through many keys. Again, all this modulation idea that I referred to before, finally returning home. So it's kind of like you start home, take this nice journey, and work your way full circle back to home. The slower movement in the middle is more lyrical, more melodic, long breath and phrasing, and pretty much resembles the style, the expressiveness that you might hear in an aria from opera. And there was definitely a strong influence of that into the slower movement. And during this slower movement, the solos was expected to ornament the phrasing as they felt necessary. Again, this is kind of going back to the just general Baroque idea of filling the space and the overly decorated style that was the Baroque. In the final movement, again, it's the return to that ritornello form, like I was talking about before, but it might be in a little bit more homophonic setting than the first movement there. And just in general, concertos and Vivaldi style specifically, it was more focused on this homophonic style, probably influenced very strongly from the opera. And in thinking forward to what we'll talk about in the classical period, it kind of foreshadows that style that we'll hear from Mozart and Haydn and Beethoven as that comes along. So, the Four Seasons, his biggest, most popular concertos. These are solo concertos, 4 of them, one for each season: summer, spring, winter, and fall. And they really show his personality in their composition and their style musically. It's very strong, restrained feeling to him, and even that correlates into his use of counterpoint as well. It's restrained. He only uses it on specific occasions to help elaborate on the idea that he's setting forth. Again, favoring this more homophonic style that foreshadows the classical that we'll talk about in coming weeks. This very strong rhythmic pulse, drive, just pushing the song forward from beginning to end. Very concise lyrical melodies. You can hear them nice and crisp and clear and clean. Everything's really clean in Vivaldi's music. And it just flows naturally from beginning to end, just like singing a song as an opera singer would do. There's definitely a strong clarity in the form, as I was just talking about before, with the ritornello form specifically in the faster movements, and then a more lyrical style in the middle section in the second movement, always the slower movement. And it's just, in general, it's a very pleasant, unintrusive sound. Nothing sticks out as an attention grabber or a shock to the system. With a little dash of humor and whimsy in them as well. The other interesting thing about these works, the Four Seasons in general, is that they're an example of programmatic works, which means that there's a storyline written behind them. Vivaldi wrote 4 poems, one for each movement, one for each of these concertos. And what you'll hear with the connection of that poem with the music is you'll hear the imitation of the subjects that are happening during the poetry of each movement. So you'll hear the imitation of bird song, thunder and lightning, dogs barking, shepherds just walking across the prairie and such. And we'll see that more specifically as we move along here. So as you might guess from all this, he started to really standardize the concerto style, his direct, driving, rhythmic fashion and such. It was a big influence on future generations, specifically Bach. Bach took a big portion of Vivaldi's works. You saw him in concert a couple times and even tried to copy out or write out the music that he heard to help listen and create his style of composition.